Hi, I'm David McNutt, an editor at IVP Academic, an imprint of University Press, and I'm pleased to be joined today by one of our authors, Gavin Ortlund. Gavin, thanks so much for your time.
Hey, my pleasure.
Gavin is the senior pastor at First Baptist Church in Ojai, California. But I want to talk with him today about the book that he published for us, Retrieving Augustine's Doctrine of Creation, Ancient Wisdom for Current Controversy. And Gavin, I love the way that this book turned out. Fantastic cover, great content. And so I really appreciate your time just to talk a little bit about it today.
Yeah, grateful to do so.
And I wanted to just start off by giving our viewers and listeners a little bit of background. Can you say a little bit about how this particular project came to be?
Yeah, circumstantially, it was the result of being at the Henry Center at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for 1 year. I did one of their fellowships that they have for the course of a year, and was just so grateful to do that. It was a huge blessing to be able to live in Chicago and just have the freedom to study. So I'm really grateful for that. But I think the reason I chose this topic to focus on that year, and I guess the deeper interest that I've had throughout my life in this topic, especially since I would say college years, is just two things. One is that creation is such a difficult and controversial doctrine. It may be one of the most controversial parts of theology for evangelicals, at least in the circles that I run in. And yet it's also a very neglected doctrine. So there's lots to creation that we tend to overlook. So it's kind of interesting that the same doctrine can be neglected and yet so controversial. And then secondly, I've just found Augustine and other pre-modern theologians to be such a help. They have insights. They're in some ways coming at this doctrine from a different angle. And so I just think there's a lot to learn. I've learned so much from Augustine myself, and the book is just sort of the overflow of that, of wanting to share a little bit of that with others.
That's great. So you're a brave soul to go to Chicagoland for a whole year, including the winter. So we were glad to have you nearby. You mentioned a little bit about learning from Augustine, and of course, retrieval, the kind of retrieval of some of the pre-modern commentators and theologians has been a bit of a theme, kind of, a popular methodology in recent theological discourse. So I wanted to start with a kind of, ask you this sort of meta question, which is, why do you think we as Christians should learn from Christians who have walked before us, and what do you think we can hope to learn from them, especially when we're, of course, separated by time and culture and language, things that keep us at arm's length in some respects from them?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll just give two reasons for this, though I bet we could unpack a lot of other reasons too.
Sure.
One reason is just coming from the doctrine of the church. So for the same reason that being a Christian means that you don't just have a personal relationship with Christ that's disconnected from the local church or other Christians around you, I think that has implications for other Christians at other times. I think being a part of the family of God has implications for how we think about history, and we see ourselves as a part of this huge tradition. And there's a lot that could be unpacked from that. But I would say, secondly, to kind of give it even a sharper edge, if I could, because this has been my own experience, that doing theology, serving as a pastor, seeking to be a Christian and follow Christ in our context here in the United States, mainly in evangelical circles for me, there's just so much we can learn. And my experience has been that dipping into these other times, these other places, it's very much felt like traveling to a different culture. So if people have ever studied abroad, or they've gone on a long vacation, or had that kind of countercultural experience where you come back home, and even if you don't necessarily agree with everything about the way people in a different culture have looked at the world, it changes the way you look at the world. It exposes some of your own assumptions, and it's just an incredibly enlarging experience. And I think that's a good metaphor for what theological retrieval is like. It helps us come at doctrines from a different angle. It sensitizes us to different concerns we may not already have had. And it's just a wonderfully stretching, and I would say humbling experience.
That's great. Well, let me just follow that up by asking a question about the things that you've learned. You know, in the book, you address several different aspects of Augustine's doctrine of creation and his interpretation in particular of Genesis 1 through 3. So I'm curious, we won't be able to get into all of those things right now. It was a fantastic range, of questions of historicity, of, animal death, all kinds of things. So what was most surprising to you as you came to Augustine's work?
It's tough to just choose one thing because there was so much to Augustine that was interesting, was intriguing. But I could just give two quick examples. One would be how emotional a doctrine creation was for Augustine. He puts a great deal of focus upon the implications for creation for creaturely happiness and just understanding what does it mean to be a creature. And without
Mm,
going too much into that, he has this wonderful enthralling vision of createdness as having this dynamic built-in sort of imperfection and longing to share in God's rest.
mm,
And whether you agree with him or not in the exact ways he understands that, it's a really interesting and intriguing and different way of thinking about creation. And I didn't expect that going into the study of him. And the
mm,
second thing I would say is just his relevance. I was really
right.
surprised at, in fact, I think I could put it this strongly, that every question, or at least every major question that modern Christians struggle with in relation to creation are anticipated by Augustine. Issues
Mm,
of the historicity of Adam and Eve, and were there other people living outside of the garden, and is Adam a symbol for humanity or a real person? Book 8 of the literal commentary on Genesis, he goes right to that, and he's kind of sensitive to the different possibilities there. Animal death, the nature of the days of Genesis 1, even
mm-hmm,
science issues, and the need to issues related to how theologians and scientists talk to each other. He wouldn't have used the term scientists. Of
right.
course, he would have called them natural philosophers, but even those things he's very sensitive to. So I was just shocked by his relevance to this topic and to the discussions that are happening today in relation to it.
That's helpful. One of the things I really appreciated about the book in one of your earlier chapters is that you addressed kind of his entire approach to scripture. And in particular, you talked at length about his humility, kind of the need to sort of embrace humility as you come to the text. And I just thought that was really helpful because I find that that's often missing in theological discourse. And so I wonder if you just might speak to kind of the benefits that you see, the importance of kind of taking that stance of humility, and maybe how that's informed your own work as well.
Hmm. Well, this was another thing that surprised me about Augustine. I didn't expect for that to be the particular thing I would observe, but I kept noticing in the way that he treats creation, in the way that he treats Holy Scripture, in the way that he treats what we would call science, there's a certain posture that he has that's willing to change, willing to um, hold particular views provisionally, willing to leave room for multiple options, willing to constantly distinguish between the central matters of importance and the kind of secondary or um, even tertiary issues. So there's just a certain posture that I found the word humility gets at well. And I've found that to be so important, especially when it comes to areas of theology where we have multiple disciplines that are sort of touching that area. So here we think of science, and we think of biblical studies, we think of theology. And it seems to me it's very easy for instance, scientists and theologians to kind of talk past one another because they're not just disagreeing about something that they're looking at equally. They're kind of looking in different directions, and they're coming at these issues in such different ways with a different focus. And so just the importance of learning to really listen, to really consider a view that at first might seem kind of outlandish or impossible, but to
Mm,
ask, well, why has this made sense to people? Why do people hold to that view? I think Augustine can really be a helpful stimulus toward that mentality. And I think that's important in every area of life, but in this doctrine, it seems especially important.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. I mentioned at the beginning that you're not only an author, you're also a pastor, senior
Mhm.
pastor at First Baptist Church of Ojai in California. So I'm wondering what kind of practical implications this has had for your ministry. Whether we're talking about the particular readings of Augustine in Genesis 1 through 3, or kind of his overall methodology, or just what have you gleaned from this project that you've seen kind of affect your own practical ministry.
Mhm. There's so much that I could mention, and I'm sure that it's shaped me in ways that I'm not even fully aware of as I'm preaching and
Right.
um, working with people. But I think one standout area would be there are so many people who have either left the faith or have anxiety about their faith in relation to issues of evolution,
Mm,
how science and Christianity intersect. And I've just seen that pattern play over and over again in many of my friends' lives. And I
mm,
don't think those issues are necessarily always the one issue, but I've just seen that those issues in the intersection of science and theology, they're often a factor for people who are wrestling with their faith. And I just find it so interesting and so relevant that Augustine himself, I mean, that's his story. But a lot of people don't realize this, but
right.
he left orthodoxy for 10 years and was a Manichaean. And one of the main issues was he didn't think that Genesis 1 fit with the most rigorous belief system that he could find. And I just find that fascinating. And then, of course, Ambrose's preaching, his allegorical way of looking at Genesis 1 was one of the factors that helped Augustine come back. And so I just think that's amazing. The great, arguably the greatest theologian of the early church, probably the most influential theologian of all time, has faced a lot of these scenarios that we are considering today. And I think his voice is helpful as we're trying to minister to others who have doubts in this area and as we work through doubts and questions ourselves.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, you drew on so many different sources of Augustine. I appreciate it. I find it interesting that he included some of his interpretation of Genesis in Confessions. He thought that that was part of his kind of personal narrative enough that he wanted to include it there. So, final question for you: what's your hope for those who find this book, who pick up this book and work through it? What's your hope of the kind of impact it could have for people's lives?
Well, and I'll hold it up here because you guys did such a great job at IVP Academic on the cover. It's just an
Yeah, thank
absolutely beautiful cover. So I'm so grateful for that because it pops out at you when you see it.
you. Yeah.
Um, I think if people reading this book would um, walk away with anything, if I had to boil it down, there's lots of particulars that I would hope for, but if one thing at the heart that I would hope they would walk away with is a sense of the immensity of this doctrine and the need to approach it with a humble frame. And Augustine, here you've got the greatest theologian of the church he wrote about 5 commentaries on Genesis, the early chapters, if you include the portions of Confessions and City of God. And he's just agonizing over this topic and he's changing his mind a great deal. And you see this sense of he's almost sort of trembling before the
Mm,
topic. There's times where he'll be answering a question about the origins of the soul in a letter, and he's just going on and on about how he's unworthy to be addressing this question, and he feels sort of rash to even go there, And so I think if people leave this book with having gotten from Augustine a sense of the relevance of this of his contribution, a sense of the hugeness and importance of creation, and a little bit of that attitude. I don't think we necessarily need to my hope wouldn't necessarily be that people leave this book with all their questions answered.
mm,
From my own experience was Augustine raised new questions, but I
right.
think he'll help answer some questions. But mainly, I hope at the attitudinal level, a sense of that humility and earnestness that he models in engaging this doctrine. I hope the book would help people see the goodness of that and the appropriateness of that.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you, Gavin. And thanks so much for your work. It was a pleasure working with you on the project. So go and check out Gavin's book, Retrieving Augustine's Doctrine of Creation today. Thanks so much for your time, Gavin. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave. Really enjoyed it.